Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be having a presentation by Professor Mieczyslaw Biskupski, a professor of history at Stanislaus A. Blejwas Endowed Chair in Polish and Polish American Studies Coordinator, Polish Studies Program at Central Connecticut State University, United States. Okay. Hollywood's War with Poland, 1939 and 1945, Professor Biskupski. Thank you, sir.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first time in my life I've ever been invited back to the same place. I was not allowed to speak over 5 hours the first time, so to punish you, I'm going to speak 7 hours today.
You've got 20 minutes.
I've got, 7 hours, 20 minutes. Where I come from, it's pretty much the same thing. I'm going to speak about a perhaps controversial topic that became of interest to me when I was a little boy, and my mother and grandmother would watch movies with me and start crying because Poland wasn't mentioned. And I pledged to them, I'm going to do it one day, and that's why I'm here. During the Second World War, Hollywood created an image of Poland and of the Poles which was in fundamental contradiction to reality. This is of great importance because the American public's understanding of the war was influenced significantly by Hollywood. Much of what the public knew of Poland's position in the war, they knew as a result of the films they saw. This raises two basic questions. What Poland was Hollywood selling, and what explains their actions? We must begin with an unfortunate background. The Americans really did not care about the East of Europe and really never had. This would explain generally the neglect of Polish issues in films, but it does not explain the content of these films. A few particulars. Norway, which played a rather minor role in the war, created a collaborationist regime with the Nazis and sent volunteers to the SS, was featured in many films. 5 alone appeared in the few months of 1942. In all of these films, the Norwegians were portrayed very sympathetically, indeed heroically. Why? Italy, a German ally in the war, was never portrayed negatively. When Italians are indeed portrayed, they're either comic characters or pathetic victims of fascism. Casablanca would give us the first example, and the film, Humphrey Bogart's film Sahara would give us the second. France, home of a collaborationist Vichy regime and a combatant against American soldiers in North Africa, was always portrayed sympathetically. The existence, thank you very much, the existence of a large and, no, I can't say what I'm doing, and devoted underground was extolled. France was bizarrely lionized. Czechoslovakia, which did nothing to resist German occupation and never created a serious underground movement, the failure of a national resistance, said the Czech historian Wojtek Masny, was repeatedly and sympathetically depicted in American film. The most famous example is the presentation of the leader of the European resistance movement in the film Casablanca as a Czech. We should also note that in the same famous film, a Gestapo officer lists centers of anti-German resistance in Europe, but he never mentions Poland. The size and significance of the Polish underground simply drew his attention, not at all. The clear implication of the film is that there was no resistance movement in Poland. But Poland was the first to fight, the home of the largest underground resistance, which of course we know, the creator of a large army which fought with distinction in many battles. Need we mention Monte Cassino or the Battle of Britain and so on and so forth. The locus of the Holocaust, the site of the Warsaw Ghetto Rising of 1943, the incomparable Warsaw Rising of 1944. Why did this get so little attention by Hollywood? Very little and very prejudicial. Indeed, most of the scenes aren't portrayed at all. Only 3 films were set in Poland during all of World War II. Let's consider each for a moment. The first and largest was a 1942 film, which many of you have probably seen, entitled To Be or Not to Be, set in occupied Warsaw. Beyond compare, the most positive depiction of the Poles of the entire war. But several things are troubling. Most strikingly, it's a comedy. Should a film set in a suffering country be a comedy? Can you imagine a comedy about the Holocaust? Were there any Hollywood comedies about Russians or French or Czechs or Norwegians and others suffering under German occupation? Did the American filmgoer understand the plight of Poland by watching a slapstick interaction of Gestapo agents? In the film, the Polish resistance movement is portrayed to be an English creation, and Poles report to British, not Polish leaders. Neither here nor in any other American film is the very existence of a Polish government in exile mentioned, and they do not control their own underground. In a celebrated bit of this dialogue, a Gestapo officer jokes that an inept Polish actor does to Shakespeare what we are doing to Poland. And then he bursts into laughter. It was not funny. Time magazine thought it was hilarious. It was disgusting. But according to film critics, the Poles show, quote, and I'm quoting the Times, obstinacy and idiocy. Their emotional patriotism is ridiculed. They are perhaps charming, but really quite silly. A country not to be taken seriously. Therefore, ignoring Poland is perfectly reasonable. Far more troubling is the 1944 film In Our Time, set also in 1939 Poland. Let us synthesize a complex film. Pre-1939 Poland was run by careless aristocrats who treated all with contempt. In the original screenplay, Polish landowners were flogging peasants. Warsaw is pro-German in 1939. High-ranking members of the Polish government are allies of the Nazis. They steadfastly refuse to modernize the army, and they flee the country when their efforts at collaboration with the Germans apparently failed. The Polish army, composed largely of ridiculous cavalry, is defeated apparently in a single day. The film's major character is a Polish landowner. He is completely incompetent, and only with the arrival of his British wife does he know how to run anything at all. She incidentally lectures the Poles on British courage in opposing Hitler, while the Poles, by comparison, apparently did not. An odd version of appeasement, to be sure. A term which magically is used to describe the Poles and not the English. She also tells her husband that Poland should be concerned about the Polish corridor, whereas the foolish Poles apparently have dismissed the issue. All farmers are all benighted peasants who have never seen a tractor, and they pray in terror when they actually do see one. Polish shopkeepers are crooks and blather patriotic nonsense, thus making proud moments in the national past appear nothing more than ridiculous. At the end, all becomes clear. Poland was a worthless, incompetent, and reactionary state run by fossils. Only a radically new government could save them. Since this film was released as Soviet forces moved into Poland, and as a screenwriter, Howard Koch was known for his communist sympathies, it is pretty obvious what this fine new Poland was going to be. The Bureau of Motion Pictures, President Roosevelt's agency to analyze films, was delighted by the film's political message and praised it highly. All the major American newspapers celebrated the film. No Allied government in World War II was portrayed in a manner something like this. It's literally political slander. It was simply an outrage, and the Polish government was badly hurt by it. The rarely noted late-war film entitled None Shall Escape is probably the first American film to actually mention the Holocaust. The Poles are depicted by a single character, and the Polish underground, is depicted by a single character, and he is insane. This compared to the large, coordinated, and effective underground in France or Czechoslovakia, which Hollywood repeatedly referred to. These are only 3 films, but I'd like to talk about a few scraps, if I might. The Polish role in the Battle of Britain is reduced to nothing in International Squadron, but countries who contributed no pilots at all are noted. Poles who appear in original screen drafts are regularly edited out, or their names are changed so they no longer appear Polish. Desperate Journey of 1942 originally referred to the Polish underground, but the issue was edited out before the film was shot. The 1942 The Conspirators features several positive Polish characters, but the final script removed all save one who was portrayed as mentally unbalanced. A heroic Pole is made a Czech in a famous movie, Lifeboat. Although in the original story he was a Polish hero, now he's a slightly demented Czech and represents the Czech position in the war, not the Polish. In Air Force, the failed and much troubled crewmate is a Pole. In action in the North Atlantic, the only sailor who wishes to leave the service and not continue in the service in the United States is a Pole. And in case you couldn't guess that, his name is Pulaski. The film Destination Tokyo has a Polish airman, but he is trained into an Irishman by Albert Maltz at the last minute. Mr. Maltz, the screenwriter, was a member of the Communist Party. Such manipulative editing is appallingly demonstrated in the much-praised Story of G.I. Joe, and I'd like to draw particular attention to this. This film is set at the Battle of Monte Cassino. The Poles, who, as we know, won the battle, are completely omitted. Credit is given to the Americans, who in reality was twice defeated by the Germans at the Battle of Monte Cassino. Victory at Monte Cassino saw the raising of the Polish flag and the playing of a Polish bugle call. In the film, it was the American flag which was raised. All three of the film's screenwriters, by the way, were members of the Communist Party. In The Edge of Darkness of 1943, the underground is all Norwegian, but there is a Pole who is nothing more than a prostitute, and she lives with a Gestapo agent where she engages in rather disgusting sexual practices. To portray one of your allies as a pro-German tramp is simply outrageous. The celebrated Why We Fight series, prepared for propaganda purposes by the American government, repeats the usual nonsense. The Polish Air Force was destroyed on the ground. The Poles relied foolishly on cavalry. The Polish population contained many traitors. The Russian invasion of September 17, 1939 was not really an invasion at all. In fact, the Russians did nothing wrong. They were trying to protect Poland against the Germans. Which makes them really allies of the Poles rather than their enemies. When the Battle of Britain is explained, the Poles are omitted from the Battle of Britain. A planned episode would discuss the military contributions of Mexico and Brazil to the Second World War, among others. No efforts by the Poles were to be included. The Russian government is endlessly praised, and this series was enormously important and shown to workers in munitions factories and members of the armed services. In broader analysis, the Poles are referred to as Polacks, are portrayed as cowards, madmen. Polish refugees are presented as cheats and liars. Major moments in the war, like the risings in Warsaw in 1943 and 1944, are never mentioned. In fine, Hollywood told the American audience very little about Poland and the Poles, but what they did say was usually insulting, degrading, and ridiculing. They either edited them out of the war or portrayed them as reactionary and ridiculous. No other ally received such treatment. When the Polish government in exile, including the legendary Jan Karski, pleaded with Hollywood to make a film about the Holocaust, they refused. The fact that biographies of Chopin and Madame Curie were issued roughly the same time is indeed a curiosity. Inevitably, we must ask why Hollywood adopted such a negative attitude towards an ally and seemingly went to some effort to edit them out of a serious role in the war. What were their motives? First, and by far the most important, was the issue of Soviet Russia. By the time the Americans entered the conflict, Moscow had already become a significant actor in the war against Germany. The Roosevelt administration and much of the American population realized that victory over such a formidable foe would be very difficult should the Americans become involved with Russia. Indeed, as some have argued, it was impossible for the Americans ever to beat the Russians, so therefore you couldn't say anything nasty about them. The greater the Soviet role, the smaller would be the cost to the Americans. Hence, the Soviets must be provided all means of support imaginable, not just money and materiel, but support for their geostrategic ambitions, as was referred to earlier today. Whereas we may wonder whether the Roosevelt administration calculated the cost of such accommodation, our answer must begin with brutal honesty. Soviet demands, ever more clear, were at the expense of the countries of Eastern Europe, particularly Poland. Hence, the propaganda agency of the Roosevelt administration, which was Hollywood, had to churn out many films heroizing the Russians and ignoring or deprecating the sacrifices of others. In fine, to discuss Poland, to raise the Polish question, inevitably requires some attention to Russia's behavior towards their Western neighbor. Hence, to say anything about Poland raises awkward questions and casts Soviet Russia inevitably in a bad light. To avoid this, two possibilities are available. Ignore Poland and thus prevent it from becoming an important subject, or portray the Poles and the Polish Second Republic in a negative light. Hollywood acted consciously to create a mythic presentation of the war which would be useful in influencing American public opinion. Czechs and Norwegians, for example, could be lauded with praise, but the Poles could not. The Russians had to be endlessly portrayed as great heroes without flaws. Closely related is the extraordinary collaboration between Hollywood and the Roosevelt administration. Washington made its wishes very clear to the studios, and one studio, Warner Brothers, for instance, told the Roosevelt administration that they regarded themselves as an agency of the American government. With the exception of MGM, all the major studios were directed by members of the Democratic Party who were hostile to the Republicans and supportive of the Roosevelt administration, and Roosevelt wanted a heroic Russia. All the studios found this rather simple. Poland had never been of interest in Hollywood, and it never was. In 1939, many Hollywood screenwriters were politically far to the left and hence well inclined to the Soviets. By contrast, Poland's international image was one of traditionalism, religious belief, and convinced opposition to communism. All these features were repellent to the Hollywood community. A controversial and difficult to quantify aspect was whether the strong Jewish presence in Hollywood was a factor. My view is it's much exaggerated. The emergence of the American film industry included many prominent Jews of Eastern Europe and Eastern European origin. They arrived in the United States, as had the Poles, at a time when Jewish-Polish relations were in a dreadful decline in Europe, beset by intolerant racism leading to resentment, if not actually hatred. Hence, it is only reasonable to conclude that Jews in Hollywood recently arrived from Eastern Europe would have little reason to paint a positive picture of Poland. Thus, there are many reasons why Hollywood would be well positioned to present an unfair, indeed perfidious image of Poland. But what resources were available to the Poles to counter this effort? Very few indeed. The Polish community in the United States was quite poor and had little influence in the larger society. The Polish government in exile had very little capacity to influence American public opinion in a manner hostile to a Roosevelt-Hollywood coalition. Simply put, the Poles were doomed to watch the suffering and gallantry of their own country being ignored and defamed, and could do very little about it. Thank you very much.
You got 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes? Well, now I must sing and dance. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Professor Biskupski.